Thank you all for coming out to our panel discussion of the movie Showgirls. I think we're going to have a good time. What I'd like to do, among the themes of this panel is, I guess, what critics sort of owe to nonfiction filmmakers, and I think that part of it I'm going to leave to, hopefully there's some of you in the audience, because I think that's probably more for you to judge than for us. But what I'd like to talk about a lot is the relationships we as critics have to the many various forms of nonfiction and how those have evolved over our careers, which I know in my case has been a pretty profound and ongoing process. So I'd like to start just by asking the panelists to introduce themselves, I guess talk about their history with TrueFalse. I know some of you guys have been here a number of times before, and just briefly talk about your history with nonfiction, and just to sort of put it in context. When I started writing in 1996 and started seeing movies in Philadelphia, where I live, the amazing breadth of documentaries was far and away the biggest surprise for me off the bat. I had seen, whatever, Roger and Me and Brothers Keeper and the Paradise Lost movies and The Thin Blue Line and a number of others, but I really didn't have any idea how much was out there even at that point, and I kind of felt both excited and a little bit angry that someone had kind of been hiding this from me all along. So I'm curious kind of what your various paths have been in that respect. So we'll start with Ella Bittencourt over here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ella, and this is my first time at TrueFalse, so I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for having me. And I guess I would say that I actually have a slightly different background. I have a background mostly in literature, so I'm coming to writing about film fairly late and to writing about documentaries. So this is almost like part of my still formative period, and I very much welcome the conversation here. But I guess I have to say these days I do most of my documentary viewing in São Paulo, where I live part of the time. And when I started watching documentaries, I think what we call social issues documentaries were the one that were kind of drawing me the most. And it took a while for me to start noticing and appreciating form, and to really start to write about it. Yeah.
My name's Adam Nayman. I'm in from Toronto. 3 people have noticed my Canadian accent in the last 24 hours, which is a record. That's never happened to me before. This is my second year at TrueFalse. I'm hoping that I'm going to keep coming back because I like it here very much. I work just generally as a film critic. I review new release films for magazines and newspapers in Toronto and write longer, more scholarly pieces for a couple of journals, and I teach a course on documentary and journalism at Ryerson at U of T, which made the panel yesterday at the Based on a True Story conference on the intersection between doc and journalism really interesting for me to come and listen to. Obviously, in my job as a regular release film critic, I come across documentaries, but because I'm in Toronto, because we have Hot Docs, which is, I think, after the one in Amsterdam, the second biggest doc festival in the world, a very influential market, a sort of premier point for a lot of films, I've maybe had a little extra opportunity to write about docs and to write about them in detail than if I lived in another Canadian city. And one of the magazines I work for is called POV, which is not to be confused with the American POV, which is much better read and much bigger. But POV is Canada's documentary magazine. And so for the last, I would say, 10 years, 4 times a year, I've written profiles of documentary filmmakers or pieces on documentary retrospectives. So I don't consider myself a specialist. It's just so happened that it's become a big part of my writing life and my teaching life. And so I feel like over the last 10 years, seeing some of the trends in terms of what kind of docs get programmed, what kind of docs get financed, what kind of docs get rejected, and what kind of docs get seen as game changers in the way media writes about them, I've kind of been present for that. I haven't been right about most of it, but I've been writing, but I've been writing about it in a lot of detail.
Anybody?
Yeah. The bell tolls finally for Nick Pinkerton.
Well, I am Nick Pinkerton, as Adam points out. And this is my second year at TrueFalse, and I've been gigging in one capacity or another as a critic for the better part of a decade, and that included a lot of time working at a weekly where I took whatever table scraps were available to me. So documentary came under that umbrella. But I can only say of my own personal relationship with the medium. I had a great class the second year I was at university, at a place called Wright State University, where the documentary class was taught by a guy called Dr. Bill Lafferty. And the first thing that he showed was David Holzman's diary. And the premise of the entire documentary class was there's no such thing as documentary. And that has suited me very well for TrueFalse. And I mean, many of the assumptions that this festival takes in programming are things that were that I was inculcated with from a fairly early age.
Ali, you mentioned social issue docs, and I wrote in from the airport with I guess one of the producers, kind of the instigator of the movie Private Violence, which is here, which is about domestic violence, and she asked me just generally as a critic, you know, to what extent do you, if you're writing about an issue doc, which is a porous category we can kind of destroy later if we wish. But she asked me to, you know, when you're writing about a movie like that, to what extent do you kind of re-report it or kind of critique it as a piece of journalism, or kind of do your own journalism just to see if it's accurate or, you know, right, and to what extent do you kind of evaluate it as a film, and how are those interrelated? So, you know, since you mentioned this, maybe we'll start with you, because I think that's, critics have, you know, very different answers to that question, I think. So.
Yeah, I know that what was talked about last year and often comes up is the fact that we as critics, if it's a social issue documentary, that we kind of get into the content of it and then the form is kind of left aside. I think that I noticed though that when a lot of documentaries are of an argumentative form and use rhetoric, that engaging with the fact how evidence is being brought up and engaging with how that evidence is being introduced and what kind of opinions are formulated at the end, that is partly engaging with form. I think an example of that would be Hoberman's article on The Last of the Unjust, right, which I thought was remarkable. I mean, I thought for a piece of film criticism, I mean, it was not only talking about technique and what we saw on the screen, but it actually did some of the kind of investigative reporting or journalism that I almost wish we got to do more often, where it was a question of, I don't know how many of you saw Lanzmann's film, The Last of the Unjust? Not that many. So, I mean, he doesn't... It wasn't released here. Okay, so I won't talk about it at length, but just to say that there was a question of Lanzmann doesn't believe in bringing in a lot of archival evidence, and so he brought in very little, but there was a question of who was brought in, who got to speak, and who not. It's obviously a film about the Holocaust, and that was pretty remarkable. Yeah.
Adam? Talking about how to write about social issue docs?
Yes.
I mean, the question of how to write about documentary totally depends on where you're writing about it and how much space you have. If I write a 2,500-word piece for POV on a social issue film like The Last White Night, which is a film about a former KKK guy and an activist sort of subsequently reconnecting. The activist in this case happened to be a member of the Freedom Riders, a Canadian guy who came down to aid in the civil rights movement. You not only have a lot of space to write about the film, you have a lot of space to do proper research and to discover if you actually know something about this topic. When you have 250 words, what critics do is pretend that they know everything about the topic so they can say, this film adds nothing new to the discussion. It's a really handy and tricky thing to do because your editor's not going to say, prove to me that you know all this so you can say that this film is old news. And most readers trust us for some stupid reason. It's why a lot of the things that critics say about writing with documentaries infuriates me, because they'll sort of say things like, this film tells us nothing that we don't know about East Timor. And I will say to them, you don't know anything about East Timor. You Wikipedia'd it, so you know who's in charge now, and now you can say, because this documentary that people made has, God forbid, talking heads, facts and figures, and an accessible editing structure, that it's a bad movie. It apparently tells us nothing that we don't know. And even if the critic does know about this particular place or person or quote-unquote social issue, I like to think of that as capital S social, capital I issue as we're talking about it, the audience might not know, or the audience might have varying degrees of knowing. And so it's when critics start saying things things like the film tells us nothing we don't know or shows us this in a way we haven't seen before. The fact is, most people don't know these things, and they haven't seen them presented one way or another at all. This is not me turning around and saying every film that's ever been made on a social issue is good, deserves the full benefit of the doubt, and should get a rave review from every critic. But when you're talking about how critics write about social issue films, I think it's the way they write about a lot of documentaries and the way they write about a lot of narrative films. I think dishonestly. I think dishonestly to varying degrees. They can do whatever kind of paltry research ahead of the fact makes them seem like an authority on a subject, and they can project that authority into their piece to readers. And in some ways, it keeps them from actually having to engage with what's in the film. They pretend they know more than the film, and so the moral of the story is they're smart. You know, that's about as blunt as I can be about it.
Okay. Nick, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
Isn't that the purpose of criticism?
Yeah.
To be smart? Yeah.
That's why we're sitting here for free.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they're sitting out there for free, Nick.
Please don't, you know, take my soapbox away from me.
No, go on.
Yeah, I would tend to concur with a lot of what Adam said, particularly the temptations of Wikipedia Insta expertise are sometimes overwhelming, and again, a lot of it is contingent upon where one is writing. If it's, you know, the pressures of a weekly beat, then you are very often going to fall back and perhaps not have the privilege of really burrowing into the subject and checking and double checking your facts and figures. And if you're faced with filling out 200 words as opposed to 2,000 words, you'll tend to perhaps fall into the punchy hot or not designation. And these are all terribly difficult lures and snares to avoid, let's say. Now, as somebody who's not really on the weekly beat anymore, I tend to give a wide berth to anything that, you know, doesn't do it for me to begin with.
Right.
And very often, perhaps, that includes issue docs that don't really rub me the right way.
Adam and Nick, I mean, you mentioned two issues which are so intimately connected as to almost be the same, which is money, well, three of it, I guess, money, space, and time, which are kind of all the same thing for working journalists. You know, documentaries often, and I think we've all sort of at various points in career and possibly currently been sort of, you know, low man on the totem pole, so to speak, or, you know, the kind of the freelancer who gets the stuff that the staff critics aren't interested in. And, you know, much more often than not, documentaries fall into that category. You know, so it means that, you know, an editorial decision has already been made that this movie is going to get, you know, if 200 words or 140 or whatever it is, you're going to get, you know, a very small amount of money for writing about it, which even calculated by minimum wage is sort of enough time to watch the movie and spend maybe a couple hours researching or writing about it, which is often not enough time to do justice to the subject or the film. And it also, just because of the space available, I mean, you at that point you have time to mention, you know, this movie was directed by so-and-so, it's about so-and-so, and then you have about 40 words left to say anything critical about it.
Which is usually, this movie tells us nothing we don't already know about each time more.
Yeah, and
about 12. So
and I'll make
That's
it
the kicker.
And I'll make it even more dire. Here's some inside baseball for those of you who are filmmakers, producers, financiers, and distributors. So a big city like Toronto, with the world's largest, most influential film festival, which has a big documentary section and docs in other sections, and Hot Docs, which is the world's second biggest doc festival, plus at least 24 niche film festivals that either center around or largely feature docs, whether it's gay and lesbian, Jewish, various diasporas, etc. So that's the scene in Toronto. Of those docs, let's say I review 120 documentary films in a year. 95 to 100 of them I'm watching on Vimeo links.
Yeah.
I'm watching on Vimeo links, sometimes you have to write the review that afternoon. I'm watching on Vimeo links, sometimes they're due tomorrow. I try and practice my job as honestly and ethically as I can. I try to practice my job as honestly and ethically as I can. You do not give your best attention to something that you're watching on Vimeo. It is very easy to dispose of something that you're watching on Vimeo mentally. You are checking your email. You are thinking about other things. You are sometimes almost writing while watching. I'm not happy about this. I'm not saying that this is good. This is true. And the reason is because documentary films do not command the same interest, or are not perceived to command the same interest in readership, or they are for places that don't have big advertising buys. So there's not a lot of money to pay critics to write about them, and editors don't care. And so distributors have started to not care. I used to go to 40 documentary press screenings a year in Toronto. Now I go to maybe 10 on top of whatever Hot Docs does. That leads to bad criticism. And also, luckily, it also happens to foreign films. Thank goodness that that's how distributors show us foreign films as well, because that's an excellent way to engage with subtitled material. And if it's a subtitled documentary, I can only imagine how that's going to be how that's going to be written about by people. So I'm not saying that you should feel bad for us, or that that film critics are totally at the mercy of circumstance. We do a good enough job doing a bad job on our own. But it doesn't make it easier when you're watching movies that way. And I kind of blame distributors for that, for not making more of an effort to set up press screenings, but then I know they can't afford it.
But that in turn, I mean, I think I realized last year at Sundance when I was having dinner with a bunch of programmers, I think that, forgive the plug here, but that an Apple TV is kind of an essential purchase for anyone writing about film at this point, because that allows you to put password-protected Vimeo links up on your TV. But if a lot of people are watching House of Cards at the time that you're watching it, and the connection starts to degrade, then the visual aspect is what gets short shrift. You can tell what's going on, but you may not. You may lose some resolution or.
But there are no visuals in documentaries, it's just talking heads, right?
Right, okay,
Yeah.
good point. So,
But that
sorry, Ella, go
pertains
ahead.
to fiction film as well,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that
Sure.
kind of shortened attention span, yeah.
Yes. I wanted to ask, I guess to go back to I guess to a number of these questions of kind of journalism and issues, and also the frames that we as critics kind of put around things. I mean, a sort of hobby horse of mine, and the one thing I wanted to do slightly differently on this totally different panel from last year's is to to not spend as much time of kind of criticizing other critics for how they've done their jobs, and to talk more about kind of how we struggle with it. But one thing that drives me crazy, and this is ironically not with the sort of third string working for peanuts critics, but often some of the very best known, best paid and most prominent critics in the country, let alone the world, is there is often, even with documentaries that they like, a tendency to treat them as what I think of as information tubes, which is to say it's just kind of a transparent way of conveying information from the filmmaker to the audience or the critic. And basically they're writing about, is this an interesting subject? Did I like these people, or what does this say about X or Y? And this sort of the idea of how it's said or not said, it really almost literally falls out of the equation. A lot of times it was just kind of a little bit shocking to me. But I think that is also a responsibility of the critic, and I think it can change with context or frame of mind. I think it's something you have to do consciously. I mean, a kind of interesting moment for me last year was seeing at this festival, which is I think by and large sort of more driven by the sort of aesthetic and formal qualities of documentaries than their sort of InfoTube virtues. Seeing a movie like Dirty Wars here last year, which when it was reviewed entirely as, what does the journalist who is the subject of this movie have to say about the subject? And for me, it played most interestingly as more of a subjective story about what the sort of psychic cost of investigating these abuses of power and the loss of life does to the person who's doing it. It was very much about kind of sort of this personal story of Jeremy Scale, and the resonant image for me in that movie was the wall of his Brooklyn apartment where he has these maps and these documents that he puts up, and the movie returned again and again to the image of him sort of taking a pushpin out of this very large bowl of pushpins and tacking another thing up on the wall, and the kind of dogged monotony of that process was, as much as anything, what that film was about for me. So, you know, we're not going to talk about the Oscars too much, but one of the films that's nominated on Sunday that you know, has very much put these issues into question and was at this festival last year is The Act of Killing, which has been recently attacked for, I think, the third or fourth time in the same manner by Nick Fraser, who's a commissioning editor for the BBC Storyville, as I believe high-minded snuff was the phrase he used, and it was basically, you know, this is what a documentary about the mass murder in Indonesia should do, because this movie does not do this thing that it's supposed to do. Therefore, it is, you know, morally repugnant and should be, you know, buried under, you know, 6 feet of earth or whatever. So, I mean, maybe we can talk I don't know, specifically about that film or generally about the issues that those kind of things raised, if anybody wants to jump in there.
Well, with regards to the question of documentary as InfoTube, I think the question that I always, particularly during my days at a weekly, and when I'd be doing a lot of perhaps not the most appealing gigs, and epidemic in New York City is the practice of four-walling, where a movie will pop up in one of these essentially for-rent theaters and get a strictly symbolic week-long run, which will then earn it a blurb in the New York Times, and I think this is still the case, the Village Voice, though I think they've scaled back a wee bit. And always the question I would ask myself is, does it make sense for this to be in a movie theater?
Right.
And, you know, if the info dump, this is not to say it's necessarily worthless, but it could function just as easily on a Vimeo link or television set or, you know, what have you. And the rubric that was always holding things up against is, does this need to be writ large?
Right.
And I think that to me is the quintessence of like cinematic documentary. If it requires, you know, that particular mode of delivery. So the info dump assumption is sort of the opposite of what I am coming from.
Right.
And also almost, I mean, I think it even goes further back to what we understand knowledge to be. I mean, what is knowledge? I mean, if we take it just as a group of facts to which we apply, I mean, this kind of disembodied thing to which we just apply analytical process, or is it about this embodied experience, which I think for The Act of Killing makes a lot of sense. I mean, I feel like we've been talking about the ending of The Act of Killing again and again, that moment with Anwar, and we had a conversation with journalists. I mean, from the journalistic point of view, it seems like it's extremely important that we know exactly what that moment is. We must be able to see it as a redemptive moment and conclude that that's what it is. I think from the point of view of knowledge as this embodied experience, it almost seems like we're more comfortable. We just know that we have witnessed something. We don't know what it is. It's important because of its duration. It's important because where it is in the narrative. It's important because of its mystery. But it's indicative of someone. I think yesterday someone said method acting, right? I mean, I think actually Eric Hines said method acting. And method acting is this idea that something in the memory of this person is coming up. We may not be able to define it, but nevertheless, as a cinematic experience, it teaches us something.
Well, the thing about a movie like The Act of Killing, which I won't analyze or talk about its content, but the existence of it, or a film like Leviathan, which was here last year, or a film like Robert Greene's Excellent Actress, which I saw last night, they're wonderful films for critics to seize upon, jump on, talk about, fight over, because they really are good to write about. What they also allow critics to do is to use these films as a club against the info dump later on. And so the talking points about documentaries among critics always boil down to whatever that year's version of those films are. Last year's The Act of Killing. This year in Toronto it was kind of Leviathan. I hope it'll end up being a film like Actress a little bit later on. I'm not saying that these films that we've just mentioned aren't worth talking about, but they seem seem to be the only films that critics kind of ever talk about because there's a lot of space for critics to do stuff with them, because they don't just sort of simply convey information, because they leave a lot to the viewer, or maybe, in the case of The Act of Killing, a movie that I think is a masterpiece, they're also kind of dubious. I think The Act of Killing is a partially dubious masterpiece, or a potentially questionable masterpiece, and boy is that fun to talk about if you're a critic, especially if you're a group of film critics, or especially if you're a voting body of film critics. The only two documentaries that the TFCA talked about at our meeting this year were Leviathan and The Act of Killing, and all people could say was, let's talk about these because they're not like the other 99.9% of documentaries. Right. This does not make me feel great in retrospect about how the other critics in Toronto or elsewhere talked about that 99.9% of documentaries in the first place. We prefer what we prefer, and I happen to like those movies a lot. But like, there's this thing at TrueFalse called neither nor, and I think unfortunately in a lot of doc criticism it becomes either or. You either have to like documentaries as journalism or kind of like them as something else, and I know what side most of the critics I hang out with fall on, and I don't think that they apply the quality of their writing and the quality of their thinking to that stuff that doesn't immediately get them excited. And I think that those critics who admit that should do themselves a favor and just say, I don't want to write about docs anymore. Because when you hear really smart critics say things, whether it's at panels here or in print or convey it through their writing, like 90% of documentaries are bad, and I'm not making that line or that statistic up, I've heard people say that, don't write about the films. Because people put 100% of themselves into the films that you think are 90% bad. So don't write about them or try harder.
I mean, the flip side of The Act of Killing might be a movie like which was also here last year, maybe like After Tiller,
right?
Which is a movie that is stylistically, certainly overtly, much less kind of ambitious or challenging, and which was received. That was actually one of the movies I was thinking of when I was talking about it being received even by critics who really liked it as, oh, this is a movie about. This is a pro-choice movie about abortion, and it makes this argument very well. That and I don't think that's what it is. I mean, I think that it's a movie about, people who are, the most sort of, extreme, principled version of pro-choice, and kind of the character, what is the character of people who are, willing to put their lives at risk
and the personal toll it took on them.
Exactly. Yeah, and that to me is more interesting than, let's re-argue this issue that no one has ever convinced anyone to switch sides on. And the other flip side of it, you mentioned Robert Greene's actress, and Robert also wrote a great article this week on the Rachel Boynton, whose movie Big Men is here, and it was very interesting because she said in that she's made these two incredible movies, which, among other things, I think are great works of sort of long-term geopolitical investigation. And yet, my understanding, she says, no, these aren't. This isn't journalism, because that's not what I am or who I am or what I do. And I would actually disagree with that. But it's interesting that has kind of to some filmmakers that is kind of their raison d'etre, and to others, I think it has a stigma of, oh, this is. Not a movie that's of interest for any reason other than that. Let me just, I think we'll maybe go to questions soon, but let me just ask, just to kind of wrap things up, about, I sort of hinted at this before, but how your understanding of, or if your understanding of documentary has changed sort of the course of, what I think are all, fairly long and I think, generally quite illustrious careers up here. So.
Well, I mean, teaching at Ryerson is interesting because I'm teaching documentary to journalism students. So part of it is a survey course. They haven't seen the films, which makes them exactly like the cinema studies students I teach at U of T. They also haven't seen the films. This is because they're 19 or 20 years old. It's not because they're not interested in films. So when I teach the documentary curriculum at Ryerson, I start with Nanook of the North, which is both considered to be the first documentary. It actually predates the coining of the term documentary in 1925. It's a documentary before that was a word. And I show Land Without Bread by Louis Buñuel, which, depending on how you look at it, is either one of the great pieces of pseudo-documentary or quasi-documentary, but is a film of real journalistic savagery in terms of what it's saying about the country where it's set.
Right.
And by the end of the course, when I get to Errol Morris and when I get to Michael Moore and I get towards the stuff that's considered more important and mainstream, I find the students are less interested. And one of the reasons they're less interested is because it's the stuff that they've already seen. So my understanding of documentary as a teacher and as a writer has come to be the same as my understanding about narrative film, which is it's unfortunate that people don't ever write about older documentaries.
Yeah.
Ever. It's not, people don't write enough about older narrative films either, unless there's a retrospective or unless it's a specialized magazine or unless someone dies. That's a pretty good way to write about older stuff. But with older documentaries, I don't think that that happens. And I think that you know, what I've learned about documentary is that there's an awful lot of films that I haven't seen, and I was never motivated to see them because nobody wrote about them. There's definitely been a big doc boom since 2000, and we all know why that is. Availability of technology, sort of accessibility of filmmaking tools, you know, more independent filmmaking. But what I've learned about documentaries that I would like to sort of learn more about it, to have an even bigger context to place some of these films in, or to place some of them against. And I think that one of the things that TrueFalse does that's really, really great is it does look backwards in some of its documentary programming and shows older films, whereas Hot Docs sometimes has sidebars, sometimes has retrospectives, but often doesn't. And the TIFF Bell Lightbox sometimes shows documentaries, but older documentaries, but not that often. So what I've learned is that we have a lot to learn to go back and look at these older films and challenge the narrative that there's like 100 key documentaries, because they're the same 100 films that show up on every list, whereas the canons of narrative cinema, feature film, tend to be more elastic and more variable.
And the other thing is that, I mean, you mentioned availability, man. I mean, many of, you know, the works that are considered sort of, you know, pillars of the documentary canon are not, and in some cases have never been available on DVD, or even Land Without Bread, I don't think has ever even been on VHS. You can find, you know, terrible looking copies of it on YouTube and stuff. I don't think there's anything by John Grierson has ever been available on DVD in the US. No. I can't think of anything by Michel Brault or you know, they're very few. I mean, Robert Flaherty is well represented, and that might be it. So Nick, if you want to go back to the history.
I would say my personal journey with documentary has been a epic trip from point A to point A, where my early interest was sparked by exposure to use a wonderful term that Adam coined, dubious masterpieces. And I've continued to look for the most dubious docs that I can find. And if any great change has taken place in the last decade, it's that more of the movies that intrinsically attract me seem to be being made. So yeah, absolutely no personal development whatsoever.
Good.
Total stasis.
That's the goal.
Criticism is a flat circle.
Yeah.
So yes, Ella, go ahead. Yeah.
I would say for me, definitely the trajectory is watching more and more films that are in the true-false category. I was just covering documentary Fortnight at MoMA in New York, and definitely I saw that you know, dichotomy of where's the context. There was a documentary there by Gonçalo Tocha, which is also about artisanal fishing in the north of Portugal, and it was introduced as this epic and very immersive documentary, but ultimately in the Q&A there was the question of, you know, there's a global crisis going on in fishing, and I just wonder how come it's not in your documentary, which is a little bit self-defeating, because I think from filmmakers it usually just you know, the response is, well, that would have been a totally different documentary. And I think that in that case, the curator kind of stepped in and said, well, that's what's so wonderful about this documentary, because it's art and it's not social issues, which I don't know how you feel about that. I'm sometimes actually worried about that distinction. Right. Oh, it's an art documentary. It's not an issue documentary. Because after that screening, actually, Tosha talked to some people from Portugal, and they came up to him and said, oh, that's so wonderful, because, you know, the sea and the fishermen, they're just such a part of our culture, and so on and so on. And he said, you know what, be careful with that. It's a very romantic, intellectual idea, when the reality of it is that no one actually talks about that way of life, and it's a way of life that's disappearing, and no one talks about the reality of fishing. And so he was making a very subtle but nevertheless a political point, which I think sometimes when we operate on that dichotomy, oh, issue over here and art over there, is totally lost. I mean, another example, Adam, not to put you on the spot, but Adam wrote a wonderful article for Reverse Shot about foreign parts, right? Which is
JP and Verena's movie.
Yeah, that's right. Which is, you know, about the place in a place in Willets Point, Queens, right? Which often I feel like by others has been described as a cautious, observational art, ethnographic film. But you called it a political film, right out there, and that was wonderful.
Well, I think that Foreign Parts is a political film, and I think a lot of the stuff that comes out of the sensory ethnography lab from Harvard has a political dimension, even if the filmmakers, I think somewhat cleverly and somewhat frustratingly, don't always want to talk about that. It's only frustrating insofar as these are obviously major movies, and these are obviously brilliant people, and they're literally PhDs. So if anyone's going to be able to talk about why their work is so smart, you know, you would think it would be them. But I also think that this is another interesting point, which is documentary filmmakers are always expected to speak to the content of their films in a way that narrative filmmakers aren't. We give narrative filmmakers a lot of the space that we afford whatever they are, eccentrics, geniuses, assholes, you know, the people who make narrative films are all of those things. And it's like, oh, it's great that he or she didn't say something about their movie. That's because it allows space for the viewer. I think a lot of people are uncomfortable having that space when they're documentary filmmakers. They kind of want to be told what the movie is about, and if the movie doesn't tell them, the filmmaker better tell them, and the filmmaker's thoughts on a topic better be in line with what the movie seems to be saying. Right. People always revel in the contradictions of art cinema, whether it's Claire Denis or Gaspar Noé or Jia Zhangke. There's this great contradiction of like, well, the filmmaker seems to think this, but the film seems to think this. Is the film thinking for itself? And people love that. When that comes to documentary, I find that documentary filmmakers often have to stay really in line with what they believe their film is about, and they always have to talk about it. And by the way, most documentary filmmakers I've met are desperate to do interviews because, oh my God, someone wants to talk to them. Right?
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that some of them may err on the side of over-explaining or being over-emphatic about their movie because they just have this opportunity, this opportunity to be interviewed. But when you mention, you're talking about it's the Earth, not the Moon, right?
Yes,
which is an amazing.
Well, actually, The Mother and the Sea, but
yeah,
that's the one that he was showing this time.
Yeah, I mean, so that's an amazing movie. The sensory ethnography labs are sort of amazing movies, and that space is starting to be fetishized a lot by film critics. This cinema of in between, which is a term that Bob Kohler coined. So whether it's a movie like Agrarian Utopia or an amazing film like Alamar by Pedro González Rubio, I think a lot of critics who consider themselves at the higher end or who have that space to write about docs, they're very happy for a film to be caught in between art and social issue. The problem with that is that, as I said before, those critics are so happy to write about those films and give them their full attention that anything that's not that doesn't get any of their attention or any of their expertise.
With maybe the exception of films that are also kind of operating more in the gallery and museum environment, which of course are very few in between. Every once in a while there's Nayman that will then be shown in a festival like Migrating Forms or
Okay. Well, I'm interested to hear, you know, as I mentioned, you know, from filmmakers in the audience, since I don't think we're really qualified to talk about what it is you might want from us. But it's also anyone else who has, you know, questions or thoughts or anything else. So there are mics here. This is being recorded, so I guess if you could, I guess they're going to step up to them, right? Is that the idea? Okay. So let's, Barbie, come on up. Come on down.
You remembered my name.
I did. I hope to know all of your names by the time we're done.
My name is Barbie Snitzer, and I have an online review site called Movie Snob. And I'd like to propose maybe a theory I've had to see if it would back up what Adam was talking about. But I'd like to preface it by saying that I don't have nearly the exposure you've had to the breadth of films that you discussed. But when my site's only been up for 2 years, and I've noticed that since Michael Moore, there's been a proliferation of what I call propagandocs. And maybe this is the reason why there's less screening, because it seems that a lot of films that are coming out now, especially with, you know, the technology makes it so that almost anyone can make a movie, they seem to be issue laden. and they almost seem to want to get a point of view across, an agenda. So, for example, if you were being hired by the National Review to write about Robert Reich's movie, I mean, could you give it a fair reading? Even though I like it, I thought it was a good movie, it's still very, very biased. And I think that a lot of what's coming out now, maybe the reason there are less screenings, is because it seems like if you're not on the right side of the issue, or I mean, they're, like you said, you know, TV quality movies, it just seems that a lot of it is agenda driven. And I think one of the things that made the act of killing so compelling is that he let the subject speak and just observed them instead of trying to direct the story the way he wanted to.
Well, then use the space of review to identify and examine and consider the bias. You know, the question of liking or not, I know that that's not what you were implying, like could I give it a fair review? I mean, I don't know what you guys would say, and you should say what you think, but I think that the best way to give that a fair review would be to acknowledge the bias, examine the bias, try and place that bias in context. Is this the general bias, and this is, you know, putting across what most documentary filmmakers on this topic or this set of topics seem to be saying, or is it countering it? I mean, at a documentary like Hot Docs, the number of films that have what I would consider to be right-wing or conservative politics hovers usually somewhere around 0. And if they're there,
Plus or minus,
and if they're there, it tends to be an accident. As a liberal, as a liberal left-wing communist Canadian, I'm often delighted by this. But it does create a certain, it can create a certain boredom, which is that, you know, you're like, I'm on side with these films, but they're all generally sort of saying what I think. But that's the lazy response. The better response would be to be like, this film flatters my point of view. Is that why it was made? Is that why it was financed? Because it flatters my point of view? How can I examine, how well does it flatter my point of view? You know, that's what you do with that, I think.
Well, I do actually, but I had to step in and defend a fellow reviewer who reviewed Pink Ribbons.
Right.
And
Canadian film.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't see it, and I admitted I hadn't seen it, but I just pointed out that my fellow reviewer did examine, he pointed out all the things the film didn't do. And then I got attacked, even though I'm a woman with breasts, I was told that I couldn't have an opinion unless I'd been diagnosed with breast cancer. And it just seems that a lot of these films are so narrow. And I'm concerned that that's the trend.
Right.
So anyway, I'll sit down.
But I would say, yeah, definitely point out the bias, but don't disqualify it as a film. I mean, I think that may be harder to do when you're watching something that's contemporary. I mean, one of the most amazing films I saw last year, I think, was Evans's The 17th Peril, which is about the war in Vietnam. And I don't know what it says about me as Eastern European American who loves propaganda films, but you know, it's a documentary set in a Vietnamese village during the bombings, during the Vietnam War. And the incredible thing is that it shows you how this village operates. And I mean, they're harvesting potatoes in the middle of the bombings, and can tell where, I mean, the stories that they tell you, it's their narrative translated then, well, into French and then I guess into English. So who knows how many layers of translations there are. But it's an incredibly lyrical and powerful film that tells you, even though it's propaganda, it tells you something about how they saw themselves at that moment in time, which you would not have seen on the other side of the conflict. And it was, in fact, it's so brilliant as a piece of propaganda. That was only when I left the cinema, like an hour later, I thought, wait a second. They're talking about things that were actually traumatic to the American bombers. And they were on the ground and they claimed that there was no trauma because they were so brilliant at having shelters that they were running entire schools and hospitals underground. So that's clearly a vision that they wanted to portray where reality has no place, yet it's totally brilliant as a film.
Right. I would just add, going back to what Nick said before and talking about the Robert Reich documentary, which is, you know, not only post Michael Moore, but I think especially post An Inconvenient Truth is really, there's very little that you take, you know, often a pre-existing thing like a PowerPoint lecture or a book, and then you just make it into a movie because that's, I guess, for people who are too lazy to read a book or something that and I would say, you know, not only why is this in a theater, but why is this a movie?
Yeah.
You know, why is the Robert Reich movie a movie when he already wrote yeah. I mean, why? You know, there's some stuff about like, oh, he's a very small person and he drives a small car, you know, and like, and he's an enormously likable person who I have tremendous respect for. But there is, in my opinion, I mean, very little justification for that movie existing in that form, except that it's shorter than reading a book. Yeah. And that is, I think, not an especially noble or interesting reason for a film to exist. So next question, if we have any, yeah, right here.
I want to thank you all for your candor in talking about your role and the mechanics of your work. Just interested in asking you to kind of take a step back and think about the way that the cultural and economic impact of your work has shifted as sort of content has exploded and consumption patterns.
Shifted, disappeared.
You know, I never really thought about that before. I don't wake up every day in a cold sweat thinking about that.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, yeah, just exactly that in the context of content explosion and shifting consumption patterns across platforms.
Oh, I don't know. Sometimes I like to interview filmmakers, and the interview sort of devolves into which one of us feels more powerless on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Is it me, the filmmaker, putting all of my money into making a movie that you will then either disparage or not review properly, or is it me, the film critic, who's being paid not very much sort of at all to write 100 or 150 words on this film, and why do I care to give it my best attention? I think that documentaries and foreign language films are often kind of at the tender mercies of film critics more than some of the other films that come out, which doesn't mean that our job is to be soft. I'm from Canada, where we're expected to be soft on Canadian films, and the good critics aren't, and then Canadian filmmakers get frustrated, and Canadian documentary filmmakers doubly so. But I think that we have a big economic impact, or through our cultural gatekeeping such as it is, we end up having a big economic impact on films that are often financed in ways that are very subterranean, or in ways that are very complicated. It's a responsibility to keep in mind, but it doesn't override the critic's responsibility to his or her own take on the movie, because that's just awful. You know, when that happens, when you're kind of like, well, God, if I don't say that this is kind of okay and give it 3 stars, because 2 stars won't help anyway. Right. So like, if there's a 1-star movie and I bump it up to 3 because I feel bad that someone financed this movie on credit cards, you are being a terrible film critic. You are inflating the market of supposedly of quality of documentary films. You're not teaching, to the extent that critics teach filmmakers stuff about their own work, if we ever do, you're not sort of doing that. You're being dishonest to yourself, and you shouldn't take the money that you're being paid to write about this. Think about it. Consider it, but just consider it as one among many, many other things.
Right. And well, the other thing for me is that also doesn't work. You know, the half-hearted 3-star review maybe makes you feel like a little bit less of a terrible person, if you're inclined to have any guilt pangs, which I'm sure none of us are.
Never.
Merciless monsters that we are. But
I love crushing the little guy.
Yeah. But it also doesn't it doesn't work because the half-hearted kind of like, oh, this is okay, but you should probably see it. No one will see anything based on that kind of a recommendation. Yeah. As far as the sort of the shifting, ever volcanically shifting terrain of film criticism, we're all like I don't know, Emily Browning and Pompeii up here, but I've had the I think rather unusual experience of after 16 years in the business. Last year I became a blogger. And I could pick up my iPhone now, and with about 3 swipes, I could tell you how many people are on Criticwire at this minute and what they're looking at and how long they've been there. And so I'm, very, for good and for ill, I'm very sort of, plugged into and aware of, who reads what and why. And I think it is definitely something that everybody is wrestling with at the moment. I think it's one of the things that always gets left out of discussions like this is the role of, speaking of gatekeepers, is the role of editors in these things, because they are the ones who let us through the gate or don't. Mm-hmm. They are the ones who decide if something's going to be reviewed, and how much space it will get, and how much they'll pay for it, and who's going to do it.
But editors answer to advertising.
Right.
departments and advertising budgets. It's as simple as that. People aren't jerks. They're not bad. They don't have bad taste. It's not that they don't want documentary to get covered. How many distributors are buying ads? And if distributors don't buy ads in print media, it may be because they're unhappy with the level of coverage they're getting in print media, which creates a kind of vicious cycle whereby they don't buy ads, and because they don't buy ads, their films can't get covered, and then they're more annoyed that their films don't get covered. Anyone with a solution, write it on a 3x5 card and send it to Film Culture, and we'll all care of Sam Adams, and we'll all be in better shape.
Yes. Sorry, Ella, did you want to add anything to that? Or?
Well, I feel like I came on the scene already in the era of post-devastation, to the point of I don't even know. I mean, if I write something and it's printed in Cineast, should I hold it and be grateful that it's in print, or should I be worried that there's no link online to it? I mean, it's just kind of the reality, which, it doesn't mean that someone will not write a very thoughtful, that a critic won't write a very thoughtful response for a publication like Reverse Shot, right? Which we kind of do on our own free time, and we do, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I differ with some of my colleagues on this and have been doing so on Twitter, I think, this week even. But I think that, pondering your influence, either, generally or on a specific film is, as a critic, I think a very profoundly bad idea. I think that way madness lies. I don't think that you do this because, if I say good things about this movie, then I will make people go it, and then that will kind of validate my position. I mean, I think you write because, if I may say so, I think criticism is an art form. It is to a certain extent a parasitic art form in that if you don't make movies, we have nothing to write about. But it is, and it exists because it is hopefully enjoyable and thought-provoking to read, and obviously we all have movies that we want to steer people towards and movies that we desperately want to steer people away from. But whether or not that works, I think is a very dangerous way and kind of soul-destroying way to judge your effectiveness. It can't be why you do it, or you should be, just move over and be an advocate instead of a critic. Or,
although those lines, I mean, they do. I'm not saying that they get blurred, but I guess in this kind of internet-connected world, I think, and it's partly amazing that you get feedback. I mean, that you actually hear from filmmakers that you wrote about their work, and I wouldn't call it a partnership, but it's this heightened awareness that now you're following someone, and they're following you in this development.
Right. I heard a couple weeks ago from a fiction filmmaker I'd written a review of their movie, and I got something wrong. And it was kind of a minor detail, but it had sort of implications for certain kind of delicate issues of tone in the film.
Pompeii wasn't a documentary, so.
Oh, God. I disagree, but we'll get into the Bazinian discussion of that later on. And one of the co-writers, kind of wrote me an email. I don't know how he got a hold of my email address, but it doesn't matter. And just said, the first line of his email was, "Oh, I'm not sure that I'm supposed to be doing this." And I've heard that sentiment before, that there's kind of, a conventional wisdom or something that filmmakers aren't supposed to talk to critics. I mean, especially when they're, they've either, as I did, gotten something wrong or said unkind things about their films. And I don't know, I wish that wasn't the case, because I think there is a profound discussion to be had there. I think it will probably always and should be a somewhat uncomfortable one, because I don't, we're not doing the same things. I mean, we serve each other's ends sometimes, and sometimes we don't. And sometimes I think the best, even the most kind of compelling review can be a critical one. I mean, I think soft praise does nobody any favors. It doesn't improve film culture. It's not interesting to read, and it doesn't get people to see movies. So there's really no reason for it to exist. But I think that back and forth is important. I mean, we serve very different ends, and I don't think I know often filmmakers feel like critics should take into account how hard something was to make, or how much time and energy and money people put into it. And I certainly am sympathetic to that point of view, while utterly rejecting it, because I'm not your mom. And the person who is going to buy a ticket or not, they have no reason to care about that,
what-
so neither should we.
No,
But
go ahead.
Oh, I have absolutely nothing.
I was just going to say, everything that Sam just said, what you do is you just internalize it by doing your job as well as you possibly can, which isn't always going to be as well as at other times. But what you just said, absolutely, like sitting around and sort of thinking about it in a protective way or in a compassionate way or an empathetic way, if you overdo that, that's bad. The best way that a filmmaker is going to take you seriously is you just do your job properly, as best as you can. And if you're bad at being a film critic, they'll think that you're doing it poorly. And if you're good at it, they'll think that you're doing it well without any extra consideration.
Right.
And if you do that, you don't have to worry about the extra coddling and extra guilt on top of it, because the first person you're being fair and honest to is yourself.
Right.
And then you just try and do your job, and hopefully someone pays you for it.
right, yeah, and exactly. And I think, rather than being nice, I mean, I think being sort of, fair and, taking into account that, people don't generally give, several years of their lives to making something that they believe is terrible, even if we might think so, is important to kind of keep in mind.
But I think sometimes it's equally important to recognize that something has been done vigorously. I mean, that something has been done passionately, that something has been done with a lot of rigor, and even if it's a failure, I don't know. I feel like history is just strewn with failures that became just these enormous talents. I mean,
look at us.
right.
But, yeah, so right here, sir.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask you if you think the way that documentary film is changing, I guess, would it help to have dedicated documentary critics, or would it just help to raise the level of knowledge among general film critics?
That's an interesting question.
And I'm sure you can say both, but what would you think is more helpful?
Well,
Thanks.
I mean, given that criticism itself isn't really like a financially practicable model, I don't know how these dedicated documentary critics are going to make a living. But yeah, I mean.
Well, I think some critics do style themselves primarily as documentary critics, and some, for whatever reason, whether it's their beat or their choice, sort of stay away from it. I mean, it's an interesting question about specialization. I don't really see what would be in it for these supposedly specializing documentary critics, because, just to be more specific even about what Nick said, I just don't think that there would be enough. There could never be more of a market for it than there already is. Like individual documentary blogs, individual documentary magazines. That's kind of what you're talking about already. I don't think that division can be officialized or sort of made, deeper than it kind of, than it already is, from venue to venue. I would say that general release magazines, dailies and weeklies, I don't think that they should have a documentary stringer any more than I think they should have a horror movie stringer. I just think they should hire the sorts of film critics who are willing to write seriously about horror movies and documentaries, both, and try and do their best, if they're assigned it, to write about it properly.
Oh, I'm incapable of specializing even in a particular art form, be it books, art, or film, so I guess I couldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a sort of mainstream critic, I mean, you try to specialize in everything, which is obviously a contradiction in terms.
Right.
But, I definitely think, many critics could stand to sort of specialize in documentary a little bit more, and their editors can, pay more attention to kind of who writes better about certain things. I mean, you don't want to kind of create a closed loop, where only certain people are allowed to speak about documentaries, because, they are, by and large, they're released for everyone as well. I mean, they're not sort of meant to be speaking to this kind of tiny, inward-looking audience, and they shouldn't be written about that way. But I definitely think, some kind of knowledge of the history of the forum and some insight into what the issues at play at the moment are is very helpful. In documentaries, not a genre, but I mean in this grouping as in any other.
But also because maybe you wouldn't want to lose that kind of fluidity between fiction and nonfiction, right? I mean, this is the space we inhabit right here, and it's to kind of see a film like Actress as to recognize its storytelling thrust, which is straight coming out of straight kind of models of fiction, is very rewarding.
Yeah. So come on up.
Oh, sorry. This kind of came up in the conversation, but it seems like people still see documentary in these very defined boxes, and they don't really realize that documentary has as much like nuance and narrative as fiction film. How do you think, like as critics, we can address that in our writing about documentary?
By trying to recognize it and address it when you see it. I mean, there are a lot of documentaries that really do tell stories. So you take a documentary that, say, finds a protagonist or a pair of like a film I saw yesterday, for instance, Approaching the Elephant, which I really liked and reminded me of Alan King's Warrendale, which is as high a compliment as I can pay a film. I had an interesting chat with you immediately after the film about the way that that's something that is basically an observational doc that behaves very stringently by the codes of observational doc, lack of music, lack of narration, whether you want to call it verite or direct cinema, which are boxes that are often confused or ticked at the same time, is up to you. But we talked about how that film is also highly narrativized, right? We know it's shot over 7 years, which is a lot longer than Warrendale was shot over, which is a year. We know the film is 90 minutes long, and we know that certain characters emerge as main characters. So even though the easy thing to say in a festival report is this very good observational / verite doc follows this and leaves space for the viewer, Ella and I were talking about it as highly narrativized, high storytelling, which protagonists are sort of being foregrounded, and why? Is there shortcutting that's going on there? Is it making it more easily accessible for us as viewers? So I don't want to put that movie in a box or even note the number of different boxes that it ticks. That's just what struck me about it. But if someone else were to watch that movie, and someone else I spoke to last night did watch that movie and have nothing to say about narrative in it at all and see it just as a movie about faces or spaces or locations, that's a perfectly valid approach as well. And I wouldn't sort of tell them not to do it because I see highly sophisticated storytelling techniques in that movie as well. That may have been like a long answer to a short question, but it just means that you got to trust that the critic kind of knows what he or she is doing and applies their knowledge to not put that movie in a box, to try and bring as much out of that movie as possible if they see it there.
I think there's a tendency, which is often indulged in, perhaps unconsciously, to write about documentary in such a way where it's addressed almost as a handicap that a really good documentary overcomes.
Yeah.
It's like, despite his club foot, he became a marathon runner. And I mean, all that one can do is, as Adam says, when these qualities are evident, point them out and not say, it's every bit as thrilling as a fiction film, because we know those are all great. Without question, 100% great.
And non-CGI.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, I mean, I think as, critics, and I think we've all, made this leap, but just to get over the idea that there's something big or complicated or taboo about sort of comparing, nonfiction to fiction. I mean, I think filmmakers are, for obvious reasons, kind of way ahead of critics on this respect. I think in a circumstance like you're talking about, Adam, I mean, I haven't seen Approaching the Elephant yet, but documentary filmmakers in that suggestion, I mean, talk freely about casting.
Yeah.
I'm going to go in and look at these people, and then I'm going to figure out who my protagonists are going to be, and and the critics would feel like, some critics just kind of feel like, oh, that's an accusation. Like you're accusing them of stacking the deck or something, and that's just, how it works. It's not such a big deal. I mean, I remember watching, or listening to Michael Apted's commentary for, 35 Up, and he basically, there's a shot in 35 Up where, spoiler alert, you find out that Jackie has had 3 or 4 children since the last movie was made, and he basically talked about, oh, this is a shot that I stole from my fiction film Coal Miner's Daughter, where he did the exactly same thing with Loretta Lynn, and he staged the shot in a documentary after a fiction film that he has made, and it's not this groundbreaking thing, but it's just not how we are sort of trained or encouraged to think about the films.
And also maybe just being attuned to the complexity. I mean, when I was watching Actress yesterday, I almost felt like I would say, and it's a compliment, that it's deceivingly simple, deceptively, because this sense of storytelling, and you have a character and you have a marriage that's unraveling, and that's something that you could identify in a fiction film. But there are other moments where, when I think of women and role-playing, and I think of that very careful lighting in the kitchen when she's kind of kneeling down, I mean, I can't help not to think about Cindy Sherman.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not even saying that Robert Greene was influenced by Cindy Sherman, but that there are these very distinct moments.
Yeah. But it's
that are
wonderful
coming
that you
straight
say
out
that,
of-
because people often really worry that if you make an allusion or a comparison in a film, the person has to have seen the film or else you can't make the comparison. I have no idea whether Robert's seen Cindy Sherman, but the fact that you would say that is wonderful, and if you put that in a review, someone who's literate enough to, not literate in this case, or visually literate enough or culturally literate enough to know or care about Cindy Sherman one way or the other is all like, oh my goodness, you mean there's an artistic component to this documentary? Whether or not it makes them see it, you've done your, I think you've done your job beautifully there. You've put documentary in conversation with the other arts, which I don't think people do with narrative cinema enough ever, and do with documentary sort of even less. And it's as if the only time people do that is if they're sure they get the reference right.
Yeah.
If they're sure the person has seen the film, they're sure the person has read the book, they're sure this is an adaptation of a movie. And I'm as guilty of that as anyone, because last night at the Q&A for Approaching the Elephant, I asked Amanda if she'd seen Warrendale. I don't know why. I should have just compared it to it without
Because
making sure
I
that
asked you
she'd
to.
seen it. Because,
Sorry,
because you asked it to. But bringing someone like Cindy Sherman into the discussion of a documentary that has nothing to do with her is a great thing for a critic writing about documentary to do, I think.
Yeah. I think we've got time for maybe two more. So let's go over here. Sir, if you would.
Hi, I'm Asher Gilzagravatis. I write for Next Projection. And question kind of coming out of something that you said, Adam. I'm someone in my capacity writing about film. I've written about a lot of sort of Vimeo link documentaries. How do you talk productively about films that you would, documentary films that you would say don't really, they just sort of fall in the middle? Like they're solidly made. Maybe they're talking about an issue that would be considered important or something, but they almost seem kind of critic-proof in a sense. Like, how do you talk productively in that sense?
Absolutely. I think that as long as what you write arrives at that conclusion, instead of beginning at that conclusion and then just kind of filling it in as lazily as possible, then I think that that's fine. I write that stuff all the time, actually, about a lot of the films that open in Toronto. The classic, like, between star and I hate star ratings anyway, but for the Globe and Mail and the Grid, you have to give them. So the classic between like 1.5 star to 2.5 star film, you just have to build a convincing case that that movie arrives in no man's land or ends up in the middle of nowhere, or in some cases has things about it that are so strong in terms of its choice of subject and weak in its treatment, or vice versa, that's why you kind of end up in the middle. But the writing should give the impression that you care enough to see that it arrived at nowhere, or arrived at somewhere less than nowhere, arrived at somewhere worse than nowhere. I often read reviews where in the first sentence, like, oh, fuck, another one of these.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it does these 4 things. Yeah. I think that if you're going to end with what I said at the beginning with the profanity there, end with it. Yeah. Don't start with it. And that just doesn't have to do with the style of the writing. That has to do with the spirit in which you undertake watching the movie. And I've actually, in the last couple of months, turned down some writing for the Globe just because I'm like, I don't have time to watch 2 90-minute movies in the next 4 hours, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I mathematically have time, but that's not going to be a good way to watch them.
Yeah.
But other times I've given into that temptation and watched movies under very time-constrained circumstances and wrote probably lazy, sloppy reviews of them for that reason. That's just a fact. It sucks. It happens.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, right there. Sure, go ahead.
I have a question about how to deal with filmmakers while you're reviewing films, because I find that...
Hide.
Well, in terms of talking about who makes a film, right? Because Robert Greene, who made Actress, his previous film was, what is it?
Fake It So
Fake It So Real, right, which is about performance,
yeah.
which is about preparing to perform, and of course Actress is in much the same way, and yet I suspect, as with a lot of content talk that comes out through reviews, many people will often neglect who's making the films,
right,
and instead just talk about the content. So we do this in narrative films, though, the opposite, right? Oeuvres, we try to connect it to previous films. So why is that absent in documentary discussions predominantly, and what can you really do to, I guess, shift that focus? I'm not really suggesting that we want to like make it an auteurist sort of strictly discussion at all times, but filmmakers, documentary filmmakers are often neglected.
I mean, I think for many of the reasons that Adam was saying. I mean, if you're, or a number of related ones. If you're, say I'm a critic and someone gives me, a Vimeo link to Actress and says, can you get me this review by 5? If I don't happen to have already seen Robert's previous films, and they haven't been, so widely distributed that I, might just have seen them in the matter of course whether or not I knew him or was interested in his work, although I do and I am. You don't have the time, or if you're getting, $50 for that review or whatever, or that, nor does it make any sense except out of the most altruistic dedication to the art to go back and watch the other 3 movies this person's made. I mean, it's very, you can do that sometimes when things really feel, important and it's something that you're passionate about and want to do anyway. But as a kind of just a, kind of dollars and cents career strategy, it doesn't make any sense. You can't watch 4 movies to review 1 too often. Unless you're getting paid enough, which is. But
to partly remedy that, I mean, I always say to the filmmaker, make sure that you keep me in the loop and make sure that I know what you're making next, and make sure that I see it, because that's one way for me to have a sense of your work over time, and it's very important.
Well, I think behind all of that is just a long-standing misconception, prejudice that whereas there is a overarching intelligence responsible for the form of a fiction film, a documentary film. Right. It just happened. Yeah. It just dropped in front of the camera. So we don't really care that much about the dude holding the camera, which of course is absurd beyond belief. Yeah.
But there's a star system for documentary filmmakers as well. A filmmaker who I really like and who I've had really good experiences with and know a little bit is Jennifer Bechwal, who's a Canadian documentary filmmaker. She made a movie called Payback, which I wrote about for The Walrus. Not Jennifer's best movie. In fact, in some ways, it's very similar to a lot of other eco-docs or issue docs that came out in Canada around that time, even though I like it. But The Walrus, which is Canada's sort of big literary magazine, was still interested in a piece on her because she has enough of a star persona, enough of an auteur persona that you can kind of, that you can write about it. So that's a space where you are allowed to do it. There is space to write about documentary auteurs, but I guess the counter to that is people write about auteurism in a way that's so disastrously wrong a lot of the time with narrative films anyway, that we can spare documentary filmmakers those spare documentary filmmaking those errors. Sometimes it's not such a bad thing.
Okay. Well, on that note, thank you all for coming. I think this has been great, and thank you guys for taking part.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.